As always, Janice and I are delighted to be with you here. And when I was here a month ago, I spoke about the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, and I showed some images of him. Today I would like to focus on Shinran and on the poetry he wrote, such as the Wasan that we just sang. Shinran is considered to be... projector not on? I'll keep going. There we go. Shinran's considered to be the founder of Jodo Shinshu, also known as Shin Buddhism. Judging by the impact that his teachings have had, he was actually one of the most significant people in the religious history of Japan. There he is. However, during his lifetime, he was not a major public figure. It was after his death, actually, that he became widely influential. So I think it's fair to call Shinran a posthumous man. It might even be that his greatest impact has yet to be made. One of my teachers has said that Jodo Shinshu is just beginning to be understood and appreciated 8 centuries after being established. The psychological depth of Shinran's teaching, a product of medieval Japan, is remarkably well suited to our own chaotic and conflicted era. I think it can speak to us very directly in 21st century America. That may not always have been the case. In an earlier era, before being brought to the West, the Jodo Shinshu teaching was in a state of what might be called hibernation, as several centuries of mostly peaceful Japanese history rolled by. Shin Buddhism became doctrinally frozen and aimed only at calming fears about the afterlife. I don't see that as having been Shinran's intent. What is it that makes a teacher deserving of honor? I think the primary consideration is that the teacher has made an example of his or her own life, as did Shinran. Jodo Shinshu cannot be separated from his life example. Appreciating the teaching requires that we have some awareness of the historical era in which he lived, which is known as the Kamakura period. It was a time of warfare and natural disasters. Jodo Shinshu is very much Shinran's response to the social and religious disintegration that he saw taking place. It seems to me that the Dharma gate of Shin Buddhism may once again have opened in our own era of disintegration. There's a traditional Chinese way of wishing difficulties on someone. May you live in interesting times. Do we not live in such an era? Well, so did Shinran. For that reason, I think we ought to listen to him seriously. Now, suppose that we want to learn about the path that he followed. It would be important to understand what exactly was his Buddhist practice. This simple question is not so easy to answer. Why is that? It's because Shinran, by around age 40, had abandoned all religious practices as they were understood in his day. After quitting the monastery and being banished from Kyoto, he described himself as neither a priest nor a layman, kind of like a minister's assistant. His Buddhism could not be defined by traditional standards. While living in the Kanto region, that was near what's now Tokyo, he was part of a Shin Buddhist community of lay people. They gathered at meeting places, or dojo. That's what we were chanting about, by the way, in Sambujo. Last is dojo. That's it. That's what it's talking about. These meeting places were in any locations that were suitable. There were no official temples and no ordained priests. Shinran called the members of the community fellow practicers, such as these fellow practicers. When the Sangha gathered, their practice did not involve priests performing rituals. The one activity that we can be certain they emphasized was Dharma listening, maybe along the lines of what you and I are doing today. To the extent that we engage with the teachings in this manner, I think we are on the right track as Shin Buddhists. The final 30 years of Shinran's life were spent in Kyoto, mostly out of the public eye. So far as one can tell, his sole focus was listening to the Dharma ever more deeply. Specifically, his Buddhist practice at this time was reading and writing. He does not mention any sort of practices beyond this. I don't get the impression that he sought to record his thoughts for posterity or that he hoped to establish a new sect of Buddhism. Rather, his reading and writing were for the purpose of asking, "What am I?" Refusing to identify himself as a teacher, he said, "For myself, I do not have even a single disciple." How ironic it is that the ripples spreading outward from the life of this truth seeker eventually would give rise to some of the most powerful religious institutions in Japan. Shinran drew inspiration from the sutras and from commentaries by his predecessors, the Pure Land Masters. Most of his writings are reflections on these ancient texts. That was his method for clarifying his understanding. The language of the texts that Shinran read was classical Chinese, and they contained quite a bit of poetry, or verses that we call gathas. Some of these ancient verses will, of course, sound familiar to you. Gagon shosegan, hishi mu jodo, shigan fumanzoku, sei fujo shogaku, which is Jusei-ge. That last character, ge, means it's the Chinese equivalent of gatha, the Indian Sanskrit word. Jusei-ge. And this is kind of a trick question, but who is the poet? Who wrote Jusei-ge? Well, who's speaking? Who's speaking in the text? It's Dharmakara, right? It's the character who's the hero of the story. So you could say he is the poet, or you could say Shakyamuni Buddha is the poet, because he was the one telling the story. Or you could say we don't know who the poet was, because it was written down long after the life of Shakyamuni. Here's another one that I'm sure you know. Kogen gigi ijin mugoku nyoze enmyo muyo tosha, which is Sanbutsuge, right? Another gatha from the larger sutra, same source. And then this one, well, we just chanted this, so I know you're aware of it. Gannishi kudoku byodo se isai dohotsubo daishin ojo anraku koku. This is the kind of the tag line, the ending that we give to every time we chant the sutras. And it was actually written by the Pure Land Master Shandao. Shandao wrote this. It was part of a longer series of verses. So these are examples of the verses that Shinran studied throughout his life. From them, he was inspired to compose his own poetry. Here's a sample. Kimyo muryo junyorai, namo fukashi ko, hozo bosatsu inniji, zaise ji zaio busho, which we just chanted, right? So these lines are from the verses known as Shoshin-ge. That ge again means verses on True Shinjin, which Shinran composed during the middle part of his life. He wrote it in Chinese, the same language as the verses that he studied in the sutras and commentaries. There's 120 lines of Shoshin-ge. Do the first 4. They're a summary of his entire teaching in a highly compressed poetic form. And when I say compressed, I mean that almost every few lines, sometimes even one line, is enough content for an entire Dharma talk. The ideas are stated in a way that requires considerable decoding if one is to grasp the meaning. Such a poem could only have been composed, I think, by a literary genius. Although we don't often talk about that aspect of Shinran, to chant Shoshin-ge eventually became the most popular practice in Jodo Shinshu, However, Shinran said nothing to advocate doing this, suggesting to me that he wrote these verses for his own study and reflection. Apart from his poems, Shinran's literary ability also shines forth in his prose writings. At times, he is unable to contain his poetic impulse, and he bursts forth with a string of rapid-fire metaphors. Whoops, too far, sorry. There we go. This is not verses, this is from some of his prose. Look at all the metaphors in here. Thus, when one has boarded the ship of the vow with great compassion and sailed out on the vast ocean of light, the winds of perfect virtue blow softly, and the waves of evil are transformed. The darkness of ignorance is immediately broken through, and quickly reaching the land of immeasurable light, one realizes great nirvana and acts in accord with the virtue of Samantabhadra. Let this be known. When he was in his 70s and 80s, Shinran continued to read and write with great energy. You know the word wasan? We were just talking about that. Wasan are poems written in the Japanese language and having just 4 lines. And here's one that is probably familiar. Mida jobutsu no kono kata wa ima ni jiko o hetama eri hoshin no korin kiwamo naku se no momyo o terasu nari. Does that sound at all familiar? Maybe if I chant it. Mida jobutsu no kono kata wa. So this is the first of the what we call Nembutsu Wasan that I think Reverend Harada chants here sometimes. There are 6 of these that are done after one chants Shoshin Ge. So you've probably done this before, this particular one, and the translation is here. Amida has passed through 10 kalpas now since realizing Buddhahood. The Dharma wheel of light is boundless. Dharma wheel of light is the korin. Dharma wheel of light is boundless, shining on the blind and ignorant of the world. Shinran composed around 400 wasan altogether. Poetry in Japanese was therefore the main literary form that he worked on in his old age. Now, why was that? It was that he was looking for a way to make the teachings available to lay people, those who could not read or understand Chinese. His poems were circulated among the members of the Shin Buddhist community. Here's another one. Chie no komyo hakari nashi, uryo no shoso kotogo toku, ko keiu kamuranu mono wa nashi, shinjitsu myo ni kimyo seyo. That's the next one in the series that we chant, right? Is Chie no koumyo hakari nashi. When we do the Nembutsu Wasa. This is the second one. With a translation, the light of wisdom exceeds all measure, and every living being receives this illumination that is like the dawn. So take refuge in the true and real light. And here is another famous wasan. Nyorai daihi no ondoku wa mi okoni shitemo hozu beshi, shishu chi shiki no ondoku mo, hone o kudakite mo shasu beshi. This is the one that we call Ondoku-san, which we just sang. Although Shinran did not give it that title, it's from a collection called Verses on the Dharma Ages. Verses on the Dharma Ages. And during adult study today, we will look at more of the wasan from that collection. The idea of Dharma Ages comes from the principle that all conditioned things are impermanent, including the teachings and practices of the historical Buddha. These too will disappear eventually. The Buddhist way of life flourished when Shakyamuni and his direct disciples were alive. Eventually, centuries later, the fundamental spirit of Buddhism diminished. What remained was only the semblance, or the external appearance of Shakyamuni's way of life. In the last Dharma age, called Mappo, some of you may know that term, the last Dharma age, even the semblance of authentic Buddhist life has vanished. The teachings themselves remain, but it is impossible to attain enlightenment in the same way as the early disciples of the Buddha. Living in the Kamakura period, Shinran saw himself as embodying both the last Dharma age, Mappo, and the path for transcending it. This understanding is what he called the true essence of the Pure Land, or Jodo Shinshu. This is Jodo Shinshu. The poem called Ondoku-san is a characteristic expression of his teaching. It's a deep reflection on the impossibility of a foolish being attaining liberation, and a deep sense of gratitude for the Pure Land teachings by which this does in fact take place. And I'll just repeat the translation that we read. Such is the benevolence of the Tathagata's great compassion that I must strive to repay it, even if my body turns to dust. Such is the benevolence of the masters and true teachers that I will thank them until my bones have crumbled. Namo Amida Butsu.